So yesterday, you should have finished our mid-chapter checkpoint. And that's reviewing our very first 5, actually 6 lessons with the 1.1a. So as you're hopefully seeing that there's a pattern, there really isn't much of a pattern, other than everything we're doing is reviewing the things that we should have learned in 4th and 5th grade. So now you're going to be seeing me pulling you to the back of the room, working on things, something that maybe you didn't do really well on in those first 5 lessons, and that's fine. Okay, so it's just me trying to help you become a better math student. Lesson 1.6 is still reviewing things that we should have learned before. Now, this might be a little bit longer video because we have to add something else to it. So they kind of throw in the order of operations to you without actually going over it in a lesson. So we're going to go over that as well, just to make sure you have a solid foundation. And that's one of those things that I do teach a little different than what the book does, because there's several steps to the order of operation that are just ignored until you are introduced to them, and then they change the order of operations around a little bit. But the main focus of this lesson is dealing with decimals, and that concept usually isn't difficult. It's just always remembering the biggest step, which is lining my decimals up. So when I go through the process, if I don't line my decimals up, like in this example, where the decimal is here and here, I get the completely wrong answer. And then people also have a tendency in addition and subtraction to count how many decimal spaces there are, and then that's how many they put in the answer. I don't do that until the next lesson, which is multiplication. So as long as I add or line up my decimals before I add or subtract, I'm usually pretty good, but I will repeat that process every single time we do one of these. The other key aspect to this lesson is knowing my place value. Usually from the decimals to the left, people really don't struggle. We think of money. There's a $1 bill, a $10 bill, a $20 bill, a $100 bill, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, million, so on and so forth. It's where we go backwards that sometimes students, even adults, get a little confused on. So when we look at the very first decimal position, where I go ones to the left, I don't have a one-ths. That doesn't even make sense. I always start with the tenths. If I think about putting a 1 there and I talk about money, that would actually be 0.10 because it would be a dime. And that's why it's the tenths position. All of these just end with an S. All of these to the right, my decimal ends with THS. That way I know that it's a decimal position when I'm doing it. So if I go tenths, well, if I skip my tenths and I put a 0 and I actually put a 1 in my next one, well, that would be 0.01 in money. That'd be 1 cent, right? Well, how many cents make up $1? And hopefully you know that's 100. And if it's 100, that's why it's called a hundredths. If I keep going, I have 0.001, then that's a thousandths. And we keep going in the same pattern as when we go to the left. So I go from a thousandths to 10 thousandths to 100 thousandths. I get into millionths. So everything is repeated going to the right other than that one's position. That is unique to the whole numbers. When I get to my decimals, then I start with tenths, hundredths, thousandths. Generally, the first 3 or 4 decimal positions is what we commonly use in 6th grade. So I have tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10 thousandths, but it would be able to continue if we went further over to the right-hand side. My process of being able to add and subtract decimals correctly is by simply making sure I follow the rules. Number 1, I always line up my decimals. The second step is to always fill in with zeros any place that it doesn't line up perfectly. My third is to bring down my decimal, directly down. Always in adding and subtracting the decimals, I bring it straight down once it's lined up so I know it's going to be in the right place after I do my math. And then my fourth is simply to do the math, if I'm adding or if I'm subtracting. All right, so let's look at what we're talking about. So we have this puppy, really cute puppy. Amanda and 3 of her friends volunteer at a local animal shelter. One of their jobs is to weigh the puppies and kittens and chart their growth. Amanda's favorite puppy weighed 2.358 pounds last month. If it gained 1.08 pounds, how much does it weigh this month? So there you show us this math here. Now, just like previously, we're not ready to estimate yet. I'm not going to give you extra work to do. So we're just going to cross out the estimation part. Once again, we will get into estimation later on in the year, but it's not needed in order to do this lesson correctly. So cross out those two pieces, and then we do the math. So when I look at the math then, I have these two that I'm going to use. So I line up my decimals. They've already done that for me in the book. Notice that space. So that space, when I go to step 2, is filling in the spaces with 0. That's that offset. It's not lined up correctly. So I just need to add a 0 so everything lines up perfectly. Step 3 is then to bring my decimal down, straight down from where it is in the math problem. And then the last step is just to do the math. I always go and I look at the sign on what I'm doing. This is addition, so I know I'm going to add, so I just add, straightforward. 8 plus 0 is 8. 5 plus 8, well, that would be 13, so I have a 3 and I carry my 1. 3 plus 1 is 4, and then 2 plus 1 is 3. So everything is lined up. I add my math correctly, so I know that has to be my final answer. So the puppy weighs 3.438 pounds this month. Now if I say that number correctly, that's 3 and 438 10,000ths. So when I say a decimal, I always say the number the way it looks. But then the name of it is always the last place value that the digit is in. And this is 348 thousandths, because I have my tenths, my hundredths, and then my thousandths. All right, so this says, is it necessary to write a 0 after 1 800ths to find the sum? Explain. Well, is it absolutely necessary? No. It's not absolutely necessary. However, it does keep us from making mistakes. So my explanation is, no, it's not absolutely necessary. It's not required. It doesn't change the value, but it does help eliminate any errors. So as long as I put that 0 there, then I will remember how everything's supposed to line up. I have some students every year that they want to do as little as possible to get to the answer, and therefore they skip that 0 and then they forget to line up their decimal. So as long as I remember I'm lining up my decimal and filling it with zeros, and I take that extra half second at the most to write a 0 in that position, it keeps me from making some silly mistakes. Explain how place value can help you add your decimals. Well, if you know your place value, it allows you to know that you're adding and subtracting the proper column. If you know that you have a number in the hundreds and a number in the hundreds, you can check real quick before adding and subtracting and make sure it's lining up correctly. Those of you who don't have the greatest handwriting in the world, you really need to slow down and make sure these line up correctly. It's usually like in division or multiplication or these decimal problems where those who have sloppy handwriting, they get, they write something out that's 4 digits long, and then they take something 3 digits long and write it out the same length, and so they just assume it's the same decimal spaces, and then they get the wrong answer. So just take some time and make sure you do it correctly. All right, so now we have a hummingbird. This is a bee hummingbird. It says the world's smallest bird has a mass of 1.836, so 1 and 836 thousandths grams. A new United States nickel has a mass of 5 grams. What is the difference in grams between the mass of a nickel and the mass of a bee hummingbird? So think about holding a regular nickel in your hand, and that this bird is a little more than 1/5 of the weight of that nickel. It's a very tiny bird. First it says to estimate, which once again we're not going to estimate. But we are going to follow the process of setting it up correctly so that we know that we're going to get the right answer. So I know I'm going to line up my decimals. I'm going to fill in my spaces with 0. Then I'm going to bring my decimal down. Then I'm going to do the math. But here's the thing. There's no decimal on the 5. Well, any whole number actually has an invisible decimal because they could have numbers behind it. So all I have to do is make sure I add the decimal and then I line it up. So as long as I make sure that I add the decimal first and then I can fill in with zeros, I'm not going to make any mistakes. Notice they've already done that for you. So once I have my decimals and I've lined them up and I fill in with my zeros now. There are 3 decimal spaces on that bottom number, so I have to make sure that I add 3 zeros up above. Then I'm going to bring my decimal down so I know it's in the right place when I do the math. And now I'm going to subtract. So 0 minus 6. Well, if I hold up a 0, I can't take 6 from it. I can't do that. I'm going to borrow from a 0. Can't do that either, can I? So it takes me all the way over to the 5 that I'm going to borrow from. So I have to borrow from my 5 to begin with, and I always borrow 1. Now that would make this a 10. And when I make it a 10 and I know I'm borrowing from it, then I know it becomes a 10. I'm going to borrow from it, and I'm going to become a 9. Because that 1 is going to be added to this one, which that one becomes a 10. But then I'm going to borrow from it, and it becomes a 9. So that 1 has to go to that 0, and that's where my 10 becomes. So a lot of times, once we get into the school year, you're going to see me doing what I just call borrowing through. When I know that I have to get the 1 all the way over here, when I borrow, I do the 4, and then I just change it to a 9, and a 10. Either way is going to work just fine, but show your work so you don't get confused as you're doing it. That leaves me with 10 minus 6. Now 10 minus 6 is 4. 9 minus 3, 9 minus 3 is 6. And 9 minus 8, that just leaves me with 1. And then I go to my whole numbers, and 4 minus 1 is 3. My caution is, if you don't show all of these things when you're borrowing through, you get to like the 4, and you cross it out, and you just assume that you're going to remember, or maybe you didn't cross it out, because you just want to get it done as soon as you possibly can, and you end up with a 4 down here because you still have 5 minus 1. Make sure that you are precise when you're doing your answers so that you have the exact number. Then when you answer it out, it says, so the mass of the new nickel is 3.1643 and 164 thousandths of grams more than the mass of the bee hummingbird. All right, so that's where we're going to take a step aside. This is not in your book, but you can write these letters in your book or even have them on a note. Well, I'm going to give you this on a note so you can add it to your math folder. Notice what we're doing in our math folder. We're building all sorts of things that we can go back to reference so I know how to do my math problems. So this is often taught about my dear Aunt Sally, and it talks about the presents from my dear Aunt Sally, but I changed the saying a little bit. My saying that I use is to ask for several extra presents from my dear Aunt Sally. So now for and from are not actually shown up there in letters, but you'll understand what we're doing here in just a second. So I would advise you to write that sentence down as I'm saying it. Ask for several extra presents from my dear Aunt Sally. The order of operations tells me that there are certain things that I have to do first before I actually get into my multiplication and division, my addition and subtraction. Now you know parentheses, at least by this point you should know parentheses. But we have some other things as well. We have this thing called absolute value, which we do learn in 6th grade. It looks kind of difficult because it's brand new, but it's probably one of the easiest concepts that we learn in 6th grade. Square roots, I'm going to introduce that to you later on in the school year, a lot later on actually, but we don't really do square roots. This crazy looking division sign basically says that if I have a number on the inside, the answer is equal to a number times itself. For example, if I take a 36, I have a square root of 36. What number times itself makes 36? So the square root of 36 is actually 6, because 6 times 6 makes 36. Exponents we get into and we use a lot this year. My exponent just tells me I'm multiplying a specific number by itself, however many times that exponent tells me. Parentheses, you know, your parentheses are going to be math inside of other numbers. Unless it's multiplication and it just shows one number, and then that means you're multiplying. Then, and this was where some students get a little confused on, my dear, multiplication and division, they go together. So that means that anytime I see multiplication, anytime I see division, I have to do them from left to right. Doesn't mean that I do all multiplication and then I do all division. So if I have 5 different things to do and I have division listed first, I'm going to divide. Then I might multiply. Then I might divide again. I go from left to right, just like I'm reading, and fill out the math problem. Now, we don't get into some really in-depth order of operation math problems until a little later. But we will get into 3, 4, 5 different steps in a math problem. And as long as I remember that I'm going to ask for several extra presents from my dear Aunt Sally, you're going to be just fine. And then my last step means that I have addition and subtraction, and I have to do them in order from left to right. If there's an addition first on the left, I'm going to do addition first, followed by subtraction. If there's a subtraction on the left first, I'm going to start with the subtraction and then do the addition. In this lesson, it's really pretty easy because what they're showing you is that I'm going to just have a parentheses that I'm going to do first. Then I'm going to have an additional math problem. But my order of operations, when I actually look at them, and you can write these down on your paper, is that I'm going to start with the absolute value, square root, exponents, and parentheses. Those 4 things have to be done first before I'm left with multiplication and then addition and subtraction. So my step 1 is to solve for all of these things, and then I'm going to do my multiplication and division, and I always do it from left to right. Whichever is first doesn't matter, always going from left to right. My final step then, I should always be left with just addition and subtraction, so I do addition and subtraction also from left to right. So once again, I'm going to give you this note for you to add to your math folder so that anytime from this point out that we're doing order of operations, as you're getting this learned and in your head, then you can look back at it. I'm also going to put my saying at the top of it, ask for several extra presents from my dear Aunt Sally, so you can remember what each of those letters are standing for. Putting that into application then, I have this math problem. In parentheses, 6 5/10 minus 1 97/100 plus 3 461 thousandths. So as I'm doing it, I know I have to do, it is required mathematically to do the parentheses first. If I do it any other way, and I try to do these last 2 things first, I will not get the same number. So I'm going to put my 6.5 minus 1.97. I'm going to follow my steps and do my order of operations. My first thing that I have to do in my steps, other than making sure I do the parentheses, is lining up my decimals. Notice, I've already done that for you. My second step would be to add zeros, and they've already done that for you as well. Once I've done that, then, before I do my math, I bring down my decimals so I don't forget it, and I make sure it's lined up in the right place, because that is key to getting a proper answer of adding and subtracting decimals. Then I can do the math. So now I look, I am subtracting, so I'm going to ask how many times is 7, or what is left when I take 7 from 0? Once again, I can't do that, can I? So I'm going to borrow from my 5, and it's going to become a 4, and I carry that 1 over so that that's a 10. Now I can take 7 from 10. And when I take 7 from 10, I get a remainder of 3. All right, so 9, and I'm going to take it away from 4. Can't do that one either. So I have to borrow from the 6. It becomes 5. And I carry the 1 over to the 4. And now I have 14 minus 9, which I can do. 14 minus 9 gives me a remainder of 5. And then I'm left with my whole numbers of 5 minus 1, which is 4. So now that I have that, notice these blue boxes tell me I'm not done. But I caution you, when you're actually doing this as your assignment, don't get an answer and just assume you're stopping. Remember to go back and look at what you were started with, and remember there's a second step. So now I'm going to take whatever that answer is, and I'm going to add to it. So my difference to these two is 4 53/100ths, and I line up my decimals. Going back to my steps. My first step, line up my decimals. I have an empty space here, so it's offset, so I'm just simply going to fill in with a 0. Then I'm going to bring my decimal down and put it in the right place. And now I go back, I'm adding, so I'm going to add my two numbers. 1 and 0 is 1. 6 and 3, well, that's 9. And then 5 and 4, that makes 9. And 4 and 3, that makes 7. There's no other math to do in the math problem, so I know I've gotten to my answer. And so my answer is 7 and 991 thousandths. Now, one of the things I have not touched on up to this point is this word expression. So we have expression and we have equation. And they sound very similar, and they kind of seem like they're similar. But there's one key difference to make it an expression instead of an equation. An expression doesn't have an equal sign. It is just this math. It's a math problem without an equal sign, without an answer. If it was an equation, it would say here's an equal sign, or it could even show an equal sign with an answer, and you have to solve for a missing number. So the idea of expression just means it doesn't have an equal sign or an answer, and an equation has an equal sign and might also have an answer. This expression is this math problem, and the answer is, once again, 7 and 991 thousandths. So now we get into our actual share and show practice problems. So a couple of them, I ran out of space when I changed the shape to fit my PowerPoint. So 4 we will be doing, I'm just going to have it on the next screen. On number 1, it says to estimate, which I'm not going to estimate. But I am going to think about lining everything up, fill it in with zeros, dropping my decimal down, and then doing the correct math. So when I start out, I have this expression, 3 and 42/100ths minus 1 and 9/10ths. I'm going to stack them correctly. Notice I've already stacked them correctly over to the right. So I have my 3 and 42/100ths minus the 1 and 9/10ths, and then they already did the second step for you. They've already added a 0. I bring down my decimal, make sure it's in the right place, and now I check, I'm subtracting, so I know I'm going to subtract. 2 minus 0 is just 2. 4 minus 9, I can't take 9 from 4 fingers. So I know I'm going to borrow from my 3, and my 3 is going to become 2, and I carry over a 1 and have 14. 14 minus 9 is 5, and then 2 minus 1 gives me a remainder of 1. So my answer to this expression is going to be 1 and 52/100ths. When I go down to my next one, I kind of lined up my direction bar a little bit. Give me a moment, I'll change that. Get it out of the way. So on this one, I have 3 different numbers with decimals that I'm going to do. Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing as I do this addition problem. I have 2 and 3/10ths, 5 and 6/8 lining up my decimals. So I'm going to have my 5 and 6/8 lined up, and then 21 and 47 thousandths. I'm still going to line up my decimals. All 3 of them have to be lined up correctly in order to do the math correctly. Once they are, then I see it's offset in different places. So then I fill in with my zeros. My top number needs 2 extra zeros. My second number needs 1 extra 0. And then my third step is to bring that decimal down. It's in the right place. Once I've done that, this is addition. So I'm going to add them. 0, 0, and 7 gives me 7. 8 and 4 and 0, well, that gives me 12. So I have a 2 that I put down, and I carry my 1. Then I have 6, 3, and 1. 6, 3, and 1. 6 and 3 is 9 plus 1 is 10. So I put my 0 and carry my 1. 5, 2, 1, and 1. All right, so 5 and 2 is 7. Plus that 1 is 8. Plus that 1 is 9. And then my 2 is by itself. Now, I'm always going to show you that I'm carrying that 1 either in multiplication or addition. I show you that I'm borrowing that 1 when I'm subtracting because I don't want to forget. A lot of times, a silly mistake when it comes to addition for my 6th graders is they don't show that 1 because they want to do it as fast as they can, and then they end up with this as 9, and they end up with this as 8, and that throws their answer completely off. So make sure that you're showing that you're carrying that 1 so you don't make any silly mistakes. Your final answer, though, because I did it all correctly, is just as I ended up with, 29 and 27 thousandths. Now on 3, they only give me 2 numbers. So one of the things we talk about in math in 6th grade is that I can take any number of additions or add-ins and add them together. I can do 3, 4, 5, 6, and I stack them all and then I can add them. I can put them in any order because I wouldn't change my answer because that's the way addition works. However, in subtraction, I always have to put the first number on top and the second number on bottom when I stack them, and I can only do 2 numbers at a time when I'm subtracting. So I have 33 and 25 hundredths minus 21 and 463 thousandths. So I'm going to put my 33 and 25 hundredths on top. I'm going to stack and line up my decimals to make sure I'm going to do everything correctly. So I have lined up my decimals correctly, and then I fill in with my zeros. Once I have everything filled in, then I'm going to bring my decimal down into the right place. Now I look, I am subtracting, so I have to start with 3, and I'm taking it away from 0, and that doesn't work. I have 0 fingers up, I can't take 3 away. So I have to borrow from my 5, it automatically becomes a 4, and I carry my 1 over. Now I have a 10, and I can take 3 from that. So I get that as 7. Now I'm going to take 4 minus 6. Once again, I can't do that. So I have to borrow from my 2. My 2 will become a 1, and I'm going to carry a 1 to make that 14. Now I have 14 minus 6, which I can do that. 14 minus 6 is 8. Now I have 1 minus 4. Can't do that either. So I'm going to borrow. My 3 becomes a 2, and I carry my 1 over. So now I have 11 minus 4. 11 minus 4 is 7. Now I have 2 minus 1, and I can do that one. So 2 minus 1 is 1. I'm left with 3 minus 2, which is 1. So I end up with, as long as I make sure I put everything in the right spots, 11 and 787 thousandths. 11.787. Now, as I said, we're going to do number 4 also. Now, number 4 is one of those 3 O things, order of operations. So I have to do my parentheses first when I'm doing my order of operations. Remember, if I ask for several extra presents, that tells me parentheses has to come first. Then I can do the multiplication and division from left to right, and then I can do the addition and subtraction from left to right. So I start with the addition. I'm going to follow my same steps of decimal work with addition. I'm going to line up my numbers. So I have 8.54, 8 and 54 hundredths. 3.46, 3 and 46 hundredths, lined up with their decimals. There isn't anything offset, so I don't have to add zeros. So I'm just going to go to dropping my decimal down into the right place. When I add, 6 and 4 is 10. I carry my 1. 5, 4, and 1, that also makes 10. So I carry my 1. And 8 plus 1 plus 3, well, that's going to give me 12. Now, if that was my answer and it wasn't money, I want to drop off my decimal and my zeros and just give my whole number. However, I still have math to do, so I'm going to keep it exactly the way it showed. I'm going to keep my 12.00, okay, that's my sum from that problem, and I'm going to line up my decimals from my number that I'm going to subtract. So when I line up my decimals, I see I indeed have an offset on that one. So step 2 is fill in with zeros. Once I've filled in with zeros, step 3 is to bring my decimal down. And then step 4, I do the math. And once again, I get a bunch of zeros that I cannot subtract from. So I have to go all the way over to the left to the first number that I can borrow from, which is my 2. So my 2, I'm going to borrow from it, and it's automatically going to become a 1. So I carry that over, and that becomes a 10, but I got to borrow from my 10. So my 10 is going to become a 9. And then I carry my 1 over, and that becomes a 10, but I'm going to borrow from it, so that becomes a 9. So once again, that's called borrowing through. Then I can put my 1 in the front. Once I have my 10 at the end, then I can subtract. 10 minus 9 is 1. 9 minus 4 is 5. 9 minus 7 is 2. And 1 minus 6 I can't do. So I got to borrow again. So this one becomes 0. You can put a 0 up or just cross it out completely and add a 1 for my 11. Then 11 minus 6 gives me 5. So I've done everything that's up there, so I'm left with 5 and 251 thousandths as my final answer. Skipping a couple problems and jumping down to, I believe it's the middle one, we're going to number 10. This looks a little different because the parentheses doesn't come first. So does that mean I add first? Doesn't mean that, does it? Because I have order of operations. As for several extra presents, has to be done first before any multiplication and division from left to right and any addition and subtraction from left to right. So I have to start with my parentheses first. So I'm going to line up my decimals. So I have 9.2. I'm going to line it up correctly with 1 and 413 thousandths. So 9.2 lined up with 1.4, and then I see that I have some offset right there. So step 2, fill in with zeros. I have 2 zeros to add. Step 3, bring my decimal down. Step 4, do the math, which I can't do, can I? I can't take 3 from 0. I can't borrow from 0. So I have to go over to the 2, it becomes 1, and then I know that this would be a 10, and I borrow from it to make it a 9, so that I make this one a 10, and I can begin doing my math. So subtracting, 10 minus 3 gives me 7, 9 minus 1 gives me 8, and then 1 minus 4 I can't do. Once again, I got to borrow. So my 9 becomes 8, and then my 1 goes with that other 1, so I have 11 now. And 11 minus 4 is 7, where 8 minus 1 is 7. So my final answer becomes 7.787. 7 and, there we go, 7 and 787 thousandths. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for just a second. But that is not my final answer, is it? I have another answer over here. Now notice it's a 54. And people who are in a hurry often just add the 54 over here underneath the 87, and they get a completely wrong answer. So I have to remember anytime I have a whole number in these type of problems with decimals that I need to just add a decimal to it. And if you do that at the very beginning, then it'll keep you from getting, into a routine and not being focused. So my 54 actually has to be lined up with this 7 over here. It looks kind of wonky, but if I add the decimal and fill in with zeros, then I can see that it lines up nice and neat. Once it's lined up with my decimals, I have my zeros filled in. I bring my decimal down, and then I'm adding, so I can add straightforward. 7 and 0 is 7, and 8 and 0 is 8, and 7 and 0 is 7. Those are pretty easy. Then I have 7 and 4, which is 11, so I carry my 1, and then 1 and 5 is 6. So I end up with 61 and 787 thousandths. When I get to that final answer, then, if I'm not caught up, then I just have to pause the video and make sure that I get it filled out. So these are my extra practice problems. Now, if If you come back to me, I had a couple people earlier last week that said, I'm not getting this. And when they showed me their book, there was nothing filled in, or maybe one problem out of the 6 or 7 that I worked with them. This is important, that you're following along, paying attention, filling out your books, that you're building this muscle memory and you're knowing how to do it. And if you're following along as I'm teaching it the first time, then I don't have to tell you, go back to your computer, rewind it, and watch the video. If you're not getting it though, and you did follow along, and I could see in your book where you're trying your best and you just didn't get it, then that's what these are going to be for. Notice we did the 10 right in the middle, so I eliminated that one. But I left 6, 7 problems for us to do and think about in case you're struggling. It's a little longer video since I had to add the order of operations lesson to it, but it's not too long to make you absolutely miserable for a Friday. You still should have enough time to get problems 2 through 11 and 1 through 6 on pages 41 and 42 finished. Once again, if you have questions while you're doing it, all you have to do is come and ask.